Good morning. Thank you all for coming. Sorry to keep you waiting a bit. I'm Eli Wilner. Welcome to the Nonprofit Help Desk's sequence on organizational development. This is course 1 of 6, as you know. I prepared the curricula for these courses, and if you look through them, you'll see that they're very ambitious. And may have been wondering how we can cover all that in one day. All I can say is we'll try our best. I'm obviously not going to go into as much depth on certain topics as I might if there were a course dedicated just to that topic, and some of these topics certainly could justify that. You know, we're talking about online marketing of your organization can be a course in and of itself. So for those, you'll get a good taste, you'll get some direction, you'll have an idea of, what to do to proceed, and, definitely some actionable information that you can use. But, that said, it's definitely not going to be the complete and last word on the topic. Other of the topics I decided to spend a little bit more time focusing on. In particular, you'll see that the program focuses more heavily on actually writing a grant proposal and the elements of a grant proposal than in other things. The idea behind that is that in all your outreach and marketing and organizational development efforts, the first and foremost thing you're interested in is providing your services. But the second thing you're most interested in is providing the fuel to enable you to provide those services, the funding. And so, probably the actual grant proposal itself, the request for funds, be it from a private sector place or a public sector place, is certainly an important thing to focus on. So you'll be getting the most hands-on with that. Let's take a look at the topics that we'll be covering today. Writing a grant proposal, writing winning grant proposals is the first topic. Chronologically, some of these other things happen first. You've got to have effective media relations and so on. But since the centerpiece here is writing a winning grant proposal, and since hopefully you're all fresher now than you will be at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we'll be starting with that. And in tandem with that, we're going to have a sort of a mini hands-on writing workshop. Obviously, in the context of a 7-hour day with a couple of breaks. You're not going to have a very intensive hands-on writing workshop also, but I want to illustrate some points, and I will be giving you some opportunity to do some independent writing, and I'll be walking around the room to assist, to help you brainstorm and to answer questions. Public outreach and promotional planning, sort of self-evident what that's all about, and we'll talk more about it when we get there. And hand in hand with that is effective event follow-up. If you're planning a dinner affair, let's say, in order to cultivate potential fundraisers or local business people in your community or what have you, well and good, but without effective follow-up, you're going to get very poor results. So that's hand in hand with the outreach. Media relations and PR, including internet PR techniques, and we'll be spending some time on those, because I suspect that many of you are at least a little bit familiar with traditional PR. We'll be talking about that, but many of you may not be that familiar with internet PR and how that's done and how it shouldn't be done. And similarly, these things sort of go in pairs. Advertising and all the new media, advertising and PR, very often go hand in hand. Often they appear in the same publication. And in the world of the internet, there are some additional twists and issues that you ought to be aware of. Everybody has a copy of the presentation in front of them. You can follow along. There's a place to make notes. I'm Eli Wilner. I've been working on and off for Nonprofit Help Desk, doing lots of different things for them, including organizational development, for close to 20 years, pretty much for about as long as NPHD has been around. I am primarily active in the private sector and the entrepreneurial type. I've started and run successfully several businesses. So a lot of what I'm going to be telling you comes from both perspectives, which I think is valuable, because especially when we're talking about things like PR, marketing, writing a proposal, these things are very similar, whether they're in the public and private sector. And I think each of these sectors that I found in the past has something to offer to the other. So you're going to be getting a dual perspective. The name of the game today is to reach beyond the funding sources that you may have been relying on for the past X number of years, and to try to spread your reach as broadly as possible, for the simple reason that many funders are simply not around anymore. They're not providing grants anymore, or they're cutting back significantly on the amounts they're providing and the number of organizations that they're providing them to. So to some extent, it has become today a numbers game. If your organization has traditionally relied upon local community organizations to provide support, there's no reason that you shouldn't be looking beyond local community organizations to provide support. There are national organizations, banks, large corporations, all of whom, or most of whom, have some kind of program for providing support for different kinds of organizations. And so it definitely pays, if you haven't already, to spend some time on the internet or networking with colleagues and peers in similar organizations, finding out, where do you go for funds, or just Googling and looking for charitable grants and things like that. There are lists out there that are available. But a key thing, don't just rely on what you've been relying on in the past, because it could be the beginning of a process that can lead to strangulation. You just have to broaden your outreach, and that implies that a lot of the organizations that you'll presumably be speaking with, you can't assume that they are as directly familiar with your organization as some of the local bank that knows all about you because you're right around the corner from them, or the local business that similarly knows all about you. You have to be much more explicit about describing what your organization is all about, the services it provides, and making a very clear case for why the particular grantor that you're sending this application to should be funding you, given that, like everyone else, they've got more limited funds than they have in the past, and probably have many more applicants than they have in the past to distribute those funds amongst. So it becomes very, very important to focus on the formality of a grant proposal, in addition to just continuing to knock on doors, which is always effective. Also, many organizations, the larger kind of grantors, Chase Foundation, let's say, just to pick one name, which does provide a lot of charitable funding to many different local organizations. J.P. Morgan Chase. J.P. Morgan Chase. Just again, you can Google any of the names that I mentioned. J.P. Morgan Chase Foundation provides a lot of grants to local grassroots kinds of organizations, which are typical of, I think, most of the organizations in this room. You can't just call up some guy on the phone and say, hey, this is who we are, what we do, sound real earnest and passionate, and expect them to say, okay, what do I just mail the check? It doesn't work like that. There's a whole formal approval process, and so you've got to know how to adhere to a more rigid grant proposal process than you may have been accustomed to, and a longer grant approval process than you may have been accustomed to, with several steps along the way. You may have to have some personal meetings that go along with it. That's not really in the scope of what we're going to be talking about, but it is definitely a more formal process. So the kind of thing that we're going to be talking about is much more critical as you expand your outreach than it may have been in the past when you were relying on less formal local sources. So let's suppose, I mentioned J.P. Morgan Chase, so we'll just use J.P. Morgan Chase as an example. I mean, they do provide grants. And by the way, almost any bank that functions in the New York metro area has some kind of a program going to fund charitable organizations, nonprofits in their areas of service. So it definitely pays to to be looking into that, especially if you've got a bank in your neighborhood, with a local branch in your neighborhood, and your best bet in that case might very well be to to walk into the branch, talk to the branch manager, and say, I want to apply to your your corporate organization. Help me out here. It helps if you have an account here too, but. Even if not, you're a local organization, and you are entitled to be asking for the help, and they want it. It makes them look good too. But you still got to go through the process. So my first point over here is you've got to understand what are the grantor's hot buttons. Now, that could be something that is a fairly steady, consistent thing. Some organizations are very focused on healthcare. And we're not talking about a healthcare specific organization. I could still be talking about a bank, but for whatever reason, the people in charge of distributing the funds, allocating the funds, they just happen to like healthcare as a cause. If your organization has absolutely nothing to do with healthcare, you're probably best served by looking someplace else, to devote your grant application energies. But if you can find some peripheral relationship between what your organization does and healthcare, then that's what you've got to play up in your grant proposal. So if you provide services to AIDS patients, that's your organization. Is that strictly speaking healthcare? Maybe you may not provide healthcare services per se, I don't know. But even if you don't, certainly that is an issue that is related to healthcare. And you can certainly spin your grant request in such a way. We're talking about, let's make it explicit here that we're not talking about making up something out of whole cloth. You're obviously going to be talking about what your organization actually does, programs you really offer, but it's to some extent a matter of presentation. With other organizations, the things they're concerned about are very ephemeral and can change from day to day. It just it's whatever may be the fad or politically correct or the interest of the president of the bank, on that particular day, and so it pays to check. Now, a lot of organizations that are, the larger organizations that are more formal about it, will have websites that explain it, and you've got to read them very carefully because a lot of times it's between the lines. So it may be out there in boldface. We help the disadvantaged. Well, great. I mean, every nonprofit to some extent, somebody helps the disadvantaged. And that's not really going to assist you in determining, this is a pest, what you should say in your grant proposal. So if you don't see it explicitly, what you should do is look for a list of other organizations that they funded in the past. So they help the disadvantaged, but you may be looking at a list of organizations that they've helped, and you may see that most of them have focused on providing remedial education. Well, okay, that's one way of helping the disadvantaged, but you're seeing that's the subliminal interest that they've got over here, and so again, if your organization does something like that, then by all means, that's what you should play up. If you've got a series of different programs and one of them focuses on education and the others don't, now when you're applying for a grant, you've got to say specifically what you're going to be using the money for. That's one of the other points that we're going to be talking about. And so pick something that that they're interested in. If you've got such a program and it legitimately could use some funding, and which program can, then that's the one that you target to that particular organization. And that's another reason it's good to have a diversity of organizations that you're applying to, because in that way you can cover a diversity of programs if in fact you've got a diversity of programs. And so that's what I mean by identify synergies between your services and the grantor's interests. There's obviously got to be some. Not every organization, has as a specific series of interests as I've mentioned. Some of them are very liberal and just listening to what you have to say. In some senses, that's a little bit easier because you just focus on what you want to specifically target. But in another sense, it's a little bit more difficult because you don't really know what's going to resonate with that kind of an organization. So you're a little bit more, sort of